This video is an overview of the legislative history research process. It describes the steps to take to research a legislative history and points to some important tools and research platforms you will use to locate documents. To start, consider why you might conduct legislative history research. The ultimate purpose of this kind of research is to understand legislative intent. By researching the documents produced during the legislative process, we seek to understand the intent of the legislature as a whole at the time the law was passed. We want to know what they knew and what they thought at the time the law was making its way through the legislative process. A very important caveat here is that we seek to understand the intent of the legislative body as a whole, not an individual legislator. While one senator's remarks in a floor debate may contribute to our understanding, they do not necessarily reflect the legislative intent in its entirety. Legislative history research, with all of its component parts, can feel like an overwhelming task to take on. But this six-step process breaks down the path from an initial inquiry and research plan to executing searches for individual legislative history documents. First, consider whether the statutory language contains an ambiguity. This question is a critical threshold that must be overcome before you begin legislative history research. If there is no ambiguity in the law, if the meaning of the law is clear on its face, then analyzing legislative intent and therefore conducting legislative history research is not necessary. You may move on to the next step in your legal research plan. Has a court already interpreted the statutory language to resolve the ambiguity? If you determine that the law in question does, in fact, satisfy the threshold question, and it is ambiguous, then your first task is to research related case law to find whether the ambiguity has already been resolved. It is possible that your legal question is not the first to address the ambiguity, and past legislation has already tackled the question and resolved the issue. The judicial opinion resolving the ambiguity may be binding primary authority or persuasive primary authority, depending on your jurisdiction. Either way, it's a critical part of your research moving forward. Step 3 is to determine if there is already a compiled legislative history published. If you determine that the law is ambiguous, that the ambiguity has not previously been resolved by a court, then your task is to find whether someone has already done the work to assemble all of the legislative history documents for the legislation in question. This is most often done for major federal legislation and is referred to as a compiled legislative history. You'll find these published in print in multi-volume sets, in Hein Online, or in a platform called ProQuest Legislative Insight. Before you tackle a search for legislative history documents yourself, search for an already compiled legislative history. Finally, in step 4, it's time to give in and plan a search. The critical piece of information to begin legislative history research is descriptive information about the ambiguous statute. You will need the bill number, the public law number, and/or the statutes at large citation to get started. In your research plan, consider what platforms will be most useful to search for the various types of documents that make up a legislative history. Different platforms have different documents covering different spans of time. Some require a subscription, some are accessible for free, but these are all factors to take into account. The most reliable platforms for locating individual documents, such as bills, hearing transcripts, or committee reports, are congress.gov, govinfo.gov, and a subscription platform called ProQuest Congressional. Remember that ProQuest Legislative Insight gave you compiled legislative histories. ProQuest Congressional is linked and is a way to search for these documents more granularly. Finally, execute your legal research plan and search for the legislative history documents. These 6 steps are meant to walk you through any legislative history question and provide a starting point for a research task that often takes many twists and turns. For help conducting legislative history research, please visit the law library or contact a law librarian.